To our video on Chapter 6. Today we're going to talk about globalization and protectionism. This chapter is divided into two sections, in my opinion. In the first section, we sort of define what is globalization and what is protectionism, and we look at the different methods for protectionism. So protectionism are government policies to reduce or block imports. And globalization concerns the movement of goods, services, and capital across borders. So because we have goods and services moving across borders and capital too, this can become worrisome for some people in some countries, but it is beneficial for many people in many countries. And so protectionism exists to block or reduce imports into a country. There are several ways of accomplishing this. You can accomplish it through tariffs, import quotas, or non-tariff barriers. So tariffs are simply going to be taxes imposed on imported products. You will notice this whenever you're purchasing something from another country, or actually you don't end up noticing it, but generally there is an import tax applied to that good or service, and it varies between what it is, and it's at a pretty granular level that taxes are applied, and so they will be in the end price of the good or service that you are consuming. Import quotas, on the other hand, are limitations on the amount of a good which can be imported. So the government might actually apply strict rules on how much of a certain good can be imported into the country. And non-tariff barriers are simply more of an abstract way at creating protectionist policies where import quotas limit the total amount, tariffs limit the amount that will be demanded because they're coming in at a higher price to the consumer, so a higher price will reduce the demand. We see that with the demand curve for taxes and subsidies. And non-tariff barriers, though, are going to be a little more abstract. So they could be different rules and regulations which make it difficult to import a particular good. If it's difficult to import, it's possibly more costly to import, and therefore it's going to cause the price of the final good or service to go up, and again produce the same sort of decrease in demand from the consumer's perspective, and also help out our domestic production. So the whole conclusion of protectionism is that protectionism is in and of itself a subsidy to producers at the expense of consumers. So consumers are going to subsidize domestic production of whatever good is being traded. And let's see how this actually applies. So if we take a look at an example, and this is an example that was in your text, I'm not going to use the numbers, but I just want to go over the theory with you. The example in the text is looking at the price of sugar in two countries. So the price of sugar in Mexico versus the price and quantities demanded and supplied of sugar in the United States. What you can see here is that the price of sugar in equilibrium in Mexico is far lower than the price in equilibrium for domestic production of sugar in the United States. So when we're in equilibrium here, we're saying there is actually no trade going on. Okay, this equilibrium price represents that there is no trade occurring. Okay, and it makes sense that perhaps the price of sugar in Mexico is lower. Perhaps the demand is lower and perhaps the supply is larger. It's just something that might be easier to produce in Mexico than in the United States. And so what one would think is, well, if the price in equilibrium with no trade is actually lower in Mexico and it's higher in the United States, then it might be a good idea for Mexican sugar farmers and sugar producers to export their product to the United States at a slightly higher price and earn a profit. So they will attempt to do this, and that is illustrated by the red dashed line. So the price with trade is going to be slightly higher. And we'll put this one over here. And the price with trade is actually going to decrease the price in the United States. So the price in Mexico is going to remain the same for domestic consumers of sugar in Mexico, but consumers of sugar in the United States are going to be able to now purchase sugar at a lower cost. And why is this? If you take a look at the intersection of this price line with our supply and demand, you see here that the quantity supplied of sugar is actually going to be greater than the quantity demanded for sugar in Mexico. And this area right here, the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, will actually be available for export to the United States. At that lower price, you can see that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. And that deficit or shortage is going to be made up by imports coming from Mexico. So therefore, the United States can benefit and Mexico can benefit from selling sugar at a higher price to the United States, and the United States can benefit because now, instead of demanding and supplying only this amount, consumers are actually going to be able to purchase more sugar than they previously were able to purchase, as represented by this third line. So they will be able to actually consume this quantity here versus the old quantity to the left, and they're going to consume it at a lower price. So this represents a win-win situation for the United States and for Mexico. Now, let's take a look at the concept of protectionism. So we know that when we have no trade, we can also analyze that situation as a situation where the price with trade plus the import tariff would equal the price with no trade. So with protectionism, okay, so the idea here is that if the United States decides that they would like to block the import of sugar from Mexico into the United States, they can apply a tax on sugar, otherwise known as a tariff. And that tariff is the import tax on the sugar. When they apply that tariff, if they apply it in an amount such that P plus the tariff, or the distance between these two lines, price with trade plus the tariff, actually equals the price with no trade, then we would see that we would have no trade occurring between the United States and Mexico. Therefore, Mexico would not be exporting sugar to the United States, and the United States would not be importing sugar from Mexico. So what happens there? Instead of the consumer being able to consume sugar at a quantity equal to our quantity demanded here, they will instead be reducing their quantity demanded, and they will be consuming it instead of at this lower price, which represents a surplus to the consumer, will be reducing their consumer surplus, and they will be consuming the sugar that's only domestically produced at a higher price. In the end, what this does is it actually just causes the consumer to be subsidizing domestic producers. So the consumer is paying a higher price, and now domestic producers of sugar are going to benefit from that subsidy by being able to charge a higher price. Otherwise, they would be charging this lower price due to pricing competitions occurring when sugar is imported. So, if we have free trade, what should occur? How does this benefit the consumer? The idea here is that with free trade, the U.S. will import sugar and pay a lower price, as the price of sugar in Mexico is lower, or any other country that they're importing from. If the price is lower in another country, we'll import it from a country where the price is lower and pay less than we would if we just had domestic production. Producers So the U.S. will import sugar and pay a lower price. This means that producers domestically in the United States will produce less sugar and sell the amount that they do produce at a lower price. This hurts the domestic producer, yes, but consumers will consume more, and they will consume it at a lower cost relative to the cost they paid before there was trade. So this would benefit consumers. Free trade Now, if we have partial protectionism, what should occur and how does this hurt the consumer? So it's possible that instead of having this completely free trade situation, we could enact a price or a tariff that does not completely remove all of the benefits of trade, but instead, say for example, the price rises to somewhere in this area. Okay, so we still have some of the benefit of trade, but we're seeing that we do have a little bit of a reduction in consumption and an increase in price as we have applied the tariff. What then happens is that you'll see domestic suppliers are now going to be supplying more than they were before, because we're going to be importing less from Mexico than we were before we had completely free trade. You can see here the demand in Mexico is changing, and the supply in Mexico is changing. Okay, so the difference being the amount supplied versus the amount demanded. Now, at this higher price, certainly Mexico is going to want to be able to supply many countries with it, but for the United States, we're going to demand more, yes, than is being supplied by domestic producers, and certainly more than the domestic producer can supply, because that's represented by this line here. However, it's going to be less than when the price was lower and there was going to be more imported from Mexico. So if we have partial protectionism, the U.S. will still import sugar from Mexico. However, they will import less than with completely free trade. Why is this? The reason is that the tariff that's enacted Okay. Therefore, the tariff will increase the price in the United States. This price increase will be price with trade plus some amount of tariff. And that will cause the price that the domestic producer is receiving to be slightly higher. And thus the price that the consumer pays will be slightly higher. So here, so still the consumer is going to benefit slightly. They're going to benefit because the price that they're paying, this price here, is going to be less than the price they would pay if there was no trade at all. Obviously, they would love to be down here, but they're actually up here because we do have a tariff applied. Now, if we have total protectionism, so if we have total protectionism, the price with trade for the United States plus that tariff that's applied is actually going to become the price without trade, and we will have no trade with Mexico. When we are not importing sugar from Mexico, this means that consumers will consume less sugar at a higher price, and producers will produce more sugar at a higher price. And so the consumer subsidizes the domestic producer. And it's important to note here that it's the U.S. consumer will consume less sugar at a higher price in the U.S., and U.S. producers will be able to produce more sugar, and they will receive a higher price for their product because there is no trade, because there is no pricing pressure coming from lower priced sugar outside of the country. So therefore, we have found that protectionism is a method of subsidizing domestic production and is paid for by domestic consumers. Consumers subsidize the domestic producers by paying higher prices. There is no pricing competition from foreign goods. Now, some of you may at some point be on the production side of this, and you might say that it's a good thing. But we feel here in economics that benefiting the consumer, the large group of people, at the expense of a few producers is actually a more equitable situation. So import tariffs and quotas and other regulations such as non-tariff barriers that make it costly or difficult to import products would not be seen as an efficient solution to solving a problem. And I don't even think that we're actually posing that that is the case. What we find with import restrictions or protectionism such as tariff import quotas and non-tariff barriers is that they're being done for a bunch of various reasons. And I would take some time to go through the rest of the text and look at what are the reasons behind protectionism. We know that who benefits would be the domestic producers, and the consumers of domestic goods are going to be the ones who pay. But what are the effects on jobs, wages, and working conditions here and outside the country? what are some reasons why protectionism is argued to be important? The text goes through different concepts such as the infant industry argument. It looks at the dumping argument. It looks at different environmental regulations arguments. Perhaps if we are importing goods from different countries and we don't have our own domestic production, we could be importing unsafe goods. Further, the national interest argument states that we have to be able to produce a certain good or service, and we cannot rely on other countries to produce things for us. What would happen if we had some sort of political falling out with that country? So what I would do if I were you is, after you're able to understand this puzzle that we've worked on here to show what happens when we have partial protectionism versus if we have free trade versus if we have total protectionism, take a look at the different arguments for and against protectionism. I think that you will find them quite interesting, and I'm sure they'll help you study for the exam that we're going to have at the end of the semester. So I hope everybody has a great week. Take care and contact me if you have any questions. Thanks. Bye.